Lockheed built it to be the most advanced airliner in America, and for a while it was. 4 turboprops, and it could work runways no jet in the country could touch. 31 months after it entered service, 5 of them had come down. Don't forget to subscribe to Terra Obscura. American Airlines did not have an Electra simulator. Its captains trained on a ground trainer instead, one fitted with the type's new flight director system, and with the old altimeter and old vertical speed indicator that the airplane did not use. Captain Albert DeWitt was 59 and had nearly 30,000 hours behind him. He finished Electra ground school on the 4th of December 1958, 84 hours of it, and started flying the aircraft a week later. On the 15th, with 8 hours on type, he took his rating check and failed the part that called for an instrument approach at a 200-foot ceiling, with 2 engines pulled to 0 thrust. He passed the next day with 12 hours. American had a rule for captains new to an aircraft. Until a man had 100 hours in command on the type, he added 100 feet of ceiling and half a mile of visibility to whatever the minimum said. On the 25th of January, the airline's regional superintendent of flying lifted that for DeWitt, who had 12.5 hours of Electra flying in scheduled service. The airline had put the Electra on the line 2 days before that, on the 23rd, running 6 round trips a day between New York and Chicago. 70 seats, and half an hour faster than the DC-7 it replaced. On the 3rd of February 1959, 11 days into Electra service, Flight 320 was meant to leave Chicago midway at 9 in the evening. Snow and wind held it 54 minutes. It got off at 9:54 with 68 passengers and 5 crew, one of the passengers an infant. LaGuardia was reporting a 400-foot overcast and 2 miles of visibility in light rain and fog. The pressure was falling quickly. Runway 22 had no instrument landing system of its own. Crews used the localizer belonging to the opposite runway instead, flown backwards, which gives a needle for direction and nothing at all for height. With no glide path, an autopilot cannot fly an airplane down that approach. DeWitt flew it in heading mode. That meant working the pitch trim wheel on the pedestal behind his right shoulder while leaning forward and reaching around the control wheel with his left hand to turn the course cursor. The Electra checklist for landing ends with one item: autopilot off. It was still engaged when the airplane hit the water. 2 of the instruments in front of him were not the ones he had trained on. On every airplane he had flown in his career, a given needle position on the vertical speed indicator meant about 750 feet a minute. On the Electra, the same position meant about 2,300. The altimeter was a drum type, with a pointer for the hundreds and 2 rotating drums and a window for the thousands. The barometric numbers ran in reverse, and 2 luminous triangles were printed either side of that window. Over New Rochelle at 1,500 feet, he set what he believed was 350 feet a minute. The real rate was between 900 and 1,000. His altimeter was reading high as well, by 80 feet from his own setting and more from calibration, which put the needle about 125 feet above where the airplane was. He crossed the LaGuardia range station showing 600 feet. He was under 500. The procedure called for 800. 20 seconds later, the altimeter passed and indicated 400, which was under 300 above the water. The board's view was that DeWitt, looking for the 100-foot pointer somewhere around 250, may have taken one of those luminous triangles for it. A Northeast Airlines DC-3 had flown the same approach 2 minutes ahead. It leveled at 400 feet, and the whole runway came into view within 15 seconds. A crew member on a tug in the channel watched the Electra pass about 12 feet above the water with no lights showing on it. It came down just under 5,000 feet short of the threshold, and 600 feet right of the center line, in 20 feet of water. 65 of the 73 were lost. The first officer, the flight engineer, and one of the 2 stewardesses got out. 2 people were never recovered. Somebody had already raised those triangles with American. The left one, in a dark cockpit, could be taken for the 1,000-foot pointer of an older altimeter, and the airline had agreed it should come off. One of its 6 Electras had had it removed. The board found no single cause and wrote that the accident was an accumulation. It was also the first one the Electra had ever had. LaGuardia lengthened its runways afterwards and improved the approach lighting. It also put an instrument landing system on runway 22. There was no flight recorder aboard. The rule required one above 25,000 feet, and the Electra could fly higher than that. But American had asked for certification below the line. The board wrote that with a recorder it could have said what happened with far more precision than it now could. The airplane was 11 days old. Final assembly had started in April, and it first flew on the 4th of September, 1959. Braniff took delivery on the 18th, and after an acceptance flight and 3 test flights, the airline put it on the line 9 days before this trip. It had 132 hours on it, and had not yet reached its first scheduled inspection. It was in service so briefly that no photograph of it is known to exist. In the 8 months since the East River, the Electra fleet had flown close to 80,000 hours, with almost nothing going wrong. On the 29th of September, Flight 542 left the ramp at Houston 22 minutes behind schedule, bound for New York with stops at Dallas and Washington. It was airborne 7 minutes later at 11:15 at night, with 28 passengers and 6 crew. Captain Wilson Stone was 47, his first officer was 39, and his flight engineer 29. None of the three had more than 95 hours on the Electra. The calls were routine. They reached company radio at 10:51 and San Antonio Center a minute after that, reporting over the Gulf Coast intersection at 9,000 feet. San Antonio cleared them onto Dallas and told them to climb to 15,000. At 11 o'clock, the flight engineer wrote a line in his logbook: 15,000 feet, 275 knots, 15 degrees Fahrenheit, outside and anti-icing off. At 7 minutes past 11, they called company radio with a message for maintenance. Nobody heard from them again. 2 minutes later, the left wing came off. They were 23 minutes into a 41-minute flight. It was partly cloudy that night with good visibility and no lightning anywhere. The wreckage came down in a long, narrow ellipse, 13,900 feet from end to end. The nose made a crater about 4 feet deep, and the center section made another one, 200 feet northeast of it. The tail lay 250 feet northwest of that, with the rudder and elevator cables caught in the tops of the trees between them. Searchers found lighter material half a mile out, and the left wing itself came down more than a mile from everything else. Watches recovered from the site had all stopped at the same time. Investigators went after the things that take airplanes apart. Sabotage came off the list early, and so did a fuel tank letting go. No other aircraft had been close enough to hit them, and the technical log held nothing they could connect to any of it. There was fire damage on the wreckage, but it had been brief, and it had started only after the left wing began to leave. Then, they went looking for metal fatigue, which is the first thing you check when a wing comes off an 11-day-old airplane, because it points at the factory. There was none. Every fracture surface on that wing, and on everything else they recovered, had been made by simple overstress. The structure had been loaded past what it was built for, and nobody could say what had loaded it. There was no flight recorder aboard. The board held public hearings and then announced it did not intend to hold any more. It estimated that a final report might take another year. On the 17th of March 1960, 6 months after Buffalo, the Civil Aeronautics Board was ready to tell Braniff that it could release the wreckage from the warehouse to the airline's insurers. They had found everything they were going to find in it. That same afternoon, a 6-month-old Electra belonging to Northwest Orient sat on the ground at Chicago Midway. It had come in from Minneapolis at 5:02. Some of the passengers who got off noticed the landing. They said it had been very hard. It stayed about 30 minutes while crews refueled it and turned it round. Flight 710 left Chicago at 22 minutes to 3 for a non-stop run to Miami, with 57 passengers, 6 crew, and sacks of mail in the hold. A company meteorologist had briefed the flight deck before departure, and nothing in that briefing mentioned clear air turbulence. At 2:45, they called Indianapolis Center over Milford at 18,000 feet, giving an estimate for Scotland, Indiana. At 13 minutes past 3, they reported over Scotland, still at 18,000, and gave an estimate for Bowling Green in Kentucky. That was the last thing anyone heard from them. 6 Air Force aircraft were flying a refueling mission above, somewhere around 31,000 feet. The airmen saw a smoke trail. 2 puffs of white smoke went up first. Seconds later came a large cloud of dark smoke and 2 loud reports. Then something large fell out of that cloud, nearly vertically, trailing smoke and flame. People below described the airplane breaking into 2 pieces, with the right wing coming down on its own. The first call to the Indiana State Police came from a woman living nearby. She told them a burning piece of wing had come down out of the sky. The fuselage went into a field in Perry County almost straight down and missed a farmhouse by very little. The crater was 30 feet across and 12 feet deep, and most of the airplane that made it ended up buried. Debris went nearly 250 feet into the air on impact. The complete right wing had left the airplane in flight, along with both outboard engines and their support structures, and the outer section of the left wing. The wing came down about 2 miles north of the crater. Between the two, searchers found pieces of 3 engines and the tip of the left wing. Wind had carried smaller material into a second debris trail about 7 miles long, running across the first one at right angles. It was the first major air disaster Indiana had ever had. Northwest did not learn in Minneapolis that the flight had come down until 20 to 5. That evening, someone telephoned the assistant postmaster in Tell City at home and sent him out to the field to look for the mail. 3 investigators from the Civil Aeronautics Board, and 8 men from Northwest reached Evansville late that day and drove out to the site. More arrived the following morning, sent by the board, by the airline, and by Allison, which had built the engines. Turbulence was the first serious explanation. It had been reported over southern Indiana at around the right time, and other aircraft in the area that afternoon described it as heavy to severe. None of it had been in the forecast the crew were handed at Chicago. The rest went the way Buffalo had gone. There was no metal fatigue anywhere in the structure, and every fracture had been made by overstress. The landing at Chicago was the one thing that had not happened at Buffalo. The Civil Aeronautics Board convened a hearing that ran 3 days and took evidence from 39 witnesses. Lockheed sent engineers, and so did the regulator, NASA, and Allison. Lockheed's men went through the ground, and flight testing the Electra had passed before certification. Others described the changes the company had already made to the tilt of the engines to deal with vibration in the type's first months of service. Whitney Gilliland, who chaired the board, opened that hearing by saying it was well aware of how closely this accident resembled the one at Buffalo 6 months earlier. Then, he ruled that facts from the Braniff crash would not form part of the testimony. The Civil Aeronautics Board wanted the Electra grounded until somebody could say what was taking the wings off it. So did a number of politicians. Elwood Quesada decided otherwise. He was a former Air Force general, and he ran the Federal Aviation Agency. On the 20th of March, 1960, 3 days after Cannelton, the agency put out an emergency airworthiness directive that cut the Electra's maximum cruising speed from 324 knots to 275. A second one followed 5 days later. That took the limit down to 225 and set a never-exceed speed of 245. The same directive told crews to feather a propeller immediately if the torque meter went to 0 or to full scale. It told them to switch the autopilot off and leave it off until somebody could design a fix, and to refuel exactly the way Lockheed specified. The type had been sold on speed. It took half an hour off Chicago to New York against the DC-7 it replaced. Passengers stayed away anyway. Loads on Electra services fell by as much as 35%. Quesada's agency also ordered Lockheed to prove the airplane was airworthy. Birds had been hitting airplanes since 1905, when Orville Wright chased a flock into a cornfield, and one of them came down on his wing. In the 55 years since, they had never brought an airliner down. Piston engines had a lot to do with that. One takes in comparatively little air through a small opening, and it will swallow a good deal without stopping. A turbine takes in far more through a much larger one. When the Allison engines on the Electra were certified, there was no rule about birds at all. The regulations for turbine engines forbade anything hazardous or unreliable, and said nothing whatever about what happens when something flies into the intake. By the autumn of 1960, the Electra fleet was still flying under the speed restriction the regulator had imposed in March. Eastern Airlines Flight 375 pushed back at Logan at 25 to 6 on the evening of the 4th of October and was cleared for takeoff 4 minutes later. It was routed down the coast through Philadelphia and Charlotte and Greenville to Atlanta, with 67 passengers and 5 crew aboard. Some of them were going home from a shoe convention in the city. 6 seconds after the wheels left runway 09, at about 120 feet, the airplane flew through a flock of starlings. Starlings travel in tight formations that can run to several thousand birds. Investigators later collected about 75 of them off the runway, and divers reported that the submerged fuselage still had birds on it. Engines 1, 2, and 4 each took in at least 1. Number 1 took in at least 8. When an engine quits on takeoff, its propeller has to be turned edge-on to the airflow, because the drag of a windmilling propeller will haul the airplane round to that side. The Electra did this by itself, through a system that watched the torque on each drive shaft and feathered the propeller the moment it fell away. That system was built on an assumption. Takeoff performance is calculated for one engine failing, so the circuits were interlocked to make certain only one propeller could ever feather itself. The first to call for it gets it, and the instant it does, the system disarms for the other 3. If 2 call at the same moment, there is a fixed order of priority. The order runs 4, 1, 3, and 2. Only one propeller ever gets it, and any others have to be feathered by hand. Number 1 called first and was feathered, exactly as designed. The system then locked out numbers 2 and 4. Both of those engines had lost power. Their propellers stayed flat. The airplane swung left, straightened back onto the runway heading, and kept climbing. At 200 feet, it swung left again and settled back to about 100 with its nose still up. Then the left wing dropped, and it went into Winthrop Bay just off the end of the runway. From the start of the takeoff roll to the water was under a minute. The fuselage broke in 2. 8 passengers and 2 of the cabin crew were thrown out of the rear section and picked up by boats that were already on the water. The front half went to the bottom of the bay with everybody else in it, including the flight crew. An inbound pilot high over the harbor called the tower to say an Electra had gone in. Within minutes, the far shore was packed with people and the traffic was backed up to downtown Boston. So many boats came out that the rescue itself started to look dangerous. 62 of the 72 were lost. The Civil Aeronautics Board put the cause down to the particular sequence in which the engines lost their power and got it back, which took the airplane's airspeed and then its control. Investigators also found that the seat and belt attachments had come apart. None of it had anything to do with the wings. The auto-feather system had done precisely what it was built to do. Afterwards, investigators sat experienced pilots in a simulator and gave them the same thing. Not one of them got the airplane home. On the 5th of December 1960, the board recommended that the regulator begin research into making turbine engines tolerate birds and study ways of keeping birds out of them in the first place. The first written guidance for engine certification appeared in 1968. The first regulation covering foreign objects going into engines came in 1974. The rule written specifically about birds was adopted in December 2000. The agency had told Lockheed to prove the airplane was safe. Nobody at the company knew yet why the wings were coming off, so they built a model. Together with NASA, they put an 8th-scale powered Electra into the wind tunnel at Langley, loosened the stiffness of the outboard engine mounts, and watched what the propellers did. A propeller on a slack mount wobbles in a circle rather than simply vibrating, and that wobble has a frequency of its own. Soften the mount enough and the frequency comes down to meet the natural frequency of the wing. Once the two match, they feed each other, and the wing comes off. Landings did the damage. The Electra's propellers were enormous, and at low power they made a lot of drag while no longer blowing air across the wing. Pull the throttles back too high above the runway, and the airplane loses thrust and lift at the same moment and drops onto its wheels. A hard enough arrival could break the upper of the 5 mounts holding an engine. Nobody could see it afterwards. With that mount gone, the engine did not droop, so walking around the airplane showed nothing at all. More than 250 engineers and technicians worked on it, and Lockheed announced the finding on the 12th of May 1960. The company then paid for the repair out of its own pocket, about $25 million. Its people strengthened the mounts, the nacelles, and the wing itself. Each airplane was off the line for a couple of weeks, and there were 165 of them in airline service. Lockheed worked around each carrier's holidays and its busiest periods. The restrictions came off on the 5th of January 1961. The last modified Electra went back to its airline that July. 10 weeks after that, an Electra came down at O'Hare. It had nothing to do with the wings. Flight 706 ran Milwaukee to Miami with stops at Chicago, Tampa, and Fort Lauderdale. It came into O'Hare early on the morning of the 17th of September. Ground crews serviced and checked it in the usual way, and a fresh crew took over. It left with 32 passengers and 5 crew. The tower cleared it for takeoff on runway 14 right at about 5 minutes to 9. The airplane was still taxiing in the run-up area when the clearance came. It acknowledged while continuing toward the runway and rolled straight onto it without stopping. Investigators never found anybody who saw it leave the ground. Witnesses first picked it up 3,000 to 4,000 feet down the runway, 50 to 75 feet up and climbing normally. By the 8,000-foot marker, it was at about 100 feet, which is slightly lower than an Electra usually reaches at that point. 5 people on the ground noticed the engine note change. Between the 8,000 and 9,000-foot markers, it started what looked like an ordinary right turn, with the bank increasing slowly. At 30 to 45 degrees of bank, the crew made a short transmission that nobody could make out. At 50 to 60 degrees, the airplane started to come down. The highest it reached in the entire turn was 200 to 300 feet. All 37 people on board were lost. Inside the aileron control system, between the control wheel and the boost unit that takes the load off it, there are cables. On the co-pilot's side, the cable that rolls the airplane to the left came away from the slack absorber it was attached to. Once that happened, the crew could not take the bank off, and they had no height to do anything else with. 2 months before this flight, somebody had changed the aileron boost unit on the airplane. To get the old one out, they had to undo the cable connectors at the slack absorber terminals. Those connectors are locked with wire so that they cannot turn on their own, and the wire has to be cut to unscrew them. The connectors were never tightened again, and the wire was never replaced. The airplane went back into service like that. It flew for 2 months. Afterwards, the Civil Aeronautics Board looked at how Northwest trained the people who worked on Electras out on the line. It found the training had been sporadic and inadequate in scope. Lockheed took its last Electra order in November 1960. The company had found the fault itself, paid for the fix, and rebuilt every airplane in service at its own expense. No new customer came back. It closed the production line at the end of 1961, after 170 airframes. The type had been carrying passengers for 3 years. The losses ran past $50 million. $25 million of that had gone on the wings, and another $7 million had gone years earlier on changing the tilt of the engines, back when the only complaint about the Electra was that it vibrated. Lockheed stock had reached nearly $33 in 1960. By the time the wings were settled, it was trading at just over $20. The chairman, Robert Gross, went out of his way to remind shareholders that Electra sales that year came to about 15% of a company turning over more than $1 billion. The airplanes themselves were sound by then. They kept flying. Braniff had already decided to be rid of its Electras. There were 11 of them, and they were going in 1969. The one that flew to Dallas on the 3rd of May, 1968, had come from the same Braniff order as the airplane that lost its wing over Buffalo 9 years earlier. 3 separate warnings went out that morning about the weather over Texas. The Weather Bureau's area forecast raised the possibility of tornadoes from the north-central part of the state up into southeastern Oklahoma. The Severe Storm Center at Kansas City was calling hail up to 2 inches across, extreme turbulence and surface winds of 65 knots. The airline's own meteorologists warned of locally severe thunderstorms over most of the second half of this particular route, and its flight manual said thunderstorms were to be gone round by at least 5 miles. Flight 352 left Houston Hobby at 11 minutes past 4 with 80 passengers and 5 crew and climbed to 20,000 feet. The storms were ahead of them within half an hour of leaving Houston. At about 25 to 5, they asked for 15,000 feet and permission to go west of their route. The controller told them the other aircraft in the area were going east. They told him that on their own radar, the west looked all right. From what they said to each other on the recorder, they believed there was a gap between 2 cells over on that side. Nobody else flying that afternoon saw a gap there, and investigators found no evidence that one had ever existed. The board went looking at how their weather radar had been tilted. The controller cleared them down to 14,000 and let them go west, then held them there a while to let a company flight past. At about 4:45, he cleared them on down to 5,000. A minute or so later, the captain had his first officer ask whether there were any reports of hail where they were. The controller said there were none, and then explained why. They were the closest anybody had come to it. Everybody else had gone round to the east. The captain told his first officer not to talk to the controller too much, because the man was trying to get them to admit they were making a mistake by coming through. A moment later, the first officer said it looked worse over on that side. They asked to turn round, and the controller told them 180 either way was approved. They rolled right, and the airplane went over. The recorder showed the bank going past 90 degrees and onto 115, the nose 40 degrees down, and the airplane descending at 16,200 feet a minute. In the attempt to pull out of it, the structure took 4.3 G, which was past what it could carry. It came apart about a mile east of Dawson and fell 6,750 feet, spread over 3 miles of Navarro County. At 10 to 5, Fort Worth reported it gone from the radar. People from Dawson were the first ones to reach it. All 85 aboard were lost. The National Transportation Safety Board was 14 months old, and this was one of the first large investigations it ran. Its finding was that the structure had been stressed beyond its ultimate strength, while the crew were trying to recover from an unusual attitude, brought on by turbulence in a thunderstorm. Being in that turbulence at all, the board said, came from a decision to fly into an area of known severe weather. The board added that the other aircraft going east and the controller saying so more than once should have been reason enough for the captain to think again. Investigators went through the wreckage for the things that had taken the wings off Electras before. They found no fatigue, no corrosion, and no design fault, and nothing mechanically wrong with the airplane before it hit the ground. It had been airworthy when it left Houston. Flight 502 was meant to leave Cusco at 8:30 on the morning of Sunday, the 9th of August, 1970. A lot of the Americans booked on it wanted to see the handicraft market at PSAC first, so the airline put the departure back to 2:45 in the afternoon. 49 American high school students were traveling together, with teachers and guides and a few family members. They had been in Peru 6 weeks and had just come from Machu Picchu, and they were going back to their host families around Lima. The exchange program that sent them was run out of Buffalo, New York. The daughter of the mayor of Lima was with the group, and one of the Peruvian couples aboard was on honeymoon. The airplane carried 92 passengers and 8 crew, and 54 of the people on it were Americans. Cusco's airport is in a valley more than 10,000 feet above the sea. Air that thin gives an airliner very little to work with. The takeoff run was 700 meters longer than it should have been. Somewhere in it, the number 3 engine failed. The crew carried on. They climbed away at the standard safety speed plus 15 knots and brought the flaps up at 300 feet. Then, at 140 knots, they began a turn to the left to bring the airplane back to the field. The bank went to somewhere between 30 and 45 degrees. The airplane came down during that turn into a hill near the village of San Geronimo, about 11 miles out from Cusco. 99 of the 100 people aboard were lost, and 2 farmers on the ground were lost with them. One man came out of it alive. He was 26 years old and a student co-pilot, and searchers found him badly hurt in a tree. He recovered, and he lives in the United States. It was the worst air accident Peru had ever had. The Peruvian investigation found that the crew had handled the engine failure badly, and that 2 other things had contributed. The airplane had been loaded wrongly, and the company's maintenance was not what it should have been. A month after the crash, the country's transport minister said the engine that failed on takeoff had run past the number of hours the regulations allowed. When the Civil Aviation Directorate came to look at the maintenance records, the airline hid one of the worksheets and tried to put a false one in its place. The sheet it hid carried a report of a mechanical defect on that airplane, written up on the flight into Cusco earlier the same day. The prosecutor in Cusco brought proceedings against the company and 5 of its officers. The government concluded the airplane had been overloaded, fined LANSA 100,000 sols, and suspended its operations for 90 days. LANSA had already lost a constellation in the mountains in 1966. It would lose its last Electra 16 months after Cusco. The government took its license in January 1972, and the company was gone before the end of that year. The exchange program in Buffalo stopped sending students abroad. About a year after the crash, somebody put up a monument on the hillside, a large white cross with a nameplate on it. By 2006, the development around it had come close enough to threaten the spot. It took a United States senator, the State Department, and the American consulate in Peru to get the landowner to agree to move the cross 150 feet so that it could stay. It was 1 o'clock in the morning on the 21st of January, 1985, and a charter at Reno was loading up to fly home to Minneapolis. Most of the people getting on it were football supporters from Minnesota who had come over for the Super Bowl weekend. There were 65 of them, with 6 crew. On the underside of the right wing, near the leading edge, an Electra has a small access door. Behind it is the fitting for the air line that spins the engines up to start them. Out on the ramp, the ground crew hooked that line up. When the supervisor signaled the flight deck to start, engines 1 and 4 came alive. Then he saw that the other handler could not get the hose off again. It was pulled tight between the cart and the panel under the wing. He gave an emergency stop signal and left his position to go and help. Somewhere in all that, nobody closed the door properly. Flight 203 left runway 16 right at about 2 minutes past 1. The sky was clear, and the visibility was 12 miles. About a minute later, the crew called the tower to say they had a vibration and wanted a left turn onto the downwind to bring the airplane back. The controller cleared it. The vibration was air getting in under an open panel and shaking the wing. The crew were trying to work out where it was coming from. They pulled the power back on all 4 engines at the same time, apparently to find out whether an engine was the source. Then they left it there, and the wing stopped flying. At 4 minutes past 1, the airplane came down in open ground 1.5 miles beyond the end of the runway, and 3/4 of a mile right of the center line, near South Virginia Street. All 6 crew and 64 of the 65 passengers were lost. The one passenger who lived was 17. George Lamson Jr. and his father had seats near the front, against a bulkhead, and the airplane broke apart close to them. The 2 of them were thrown about 40 feet clear. His father did not survive his injuries, and neither did the 3rd man taken to hospital that night. The National Transportation Safety Board found that the captain had failed to control the airplane's flight path and airspeed, and that the co-pilot had failed to monitor them. That breakdown between the 2 of them followed the onset of the vibration. The board listed the ground handlers failing to close the air start access door as a contributing factor. Pilots across the Electra fleet already knew about this. Galaxy's own former director of operations had felt it himself back in the 1970s. Most of the ones who had been through it never worked out at the time what was shaking the airplane, but they all remembered it. Several carriers had gone ahead and modified the doors on their own aircraft. One of them had 21 Electras and had done every single one. The regulator had never issued a certificate for that modification. An operator buying a second-hand Electra could therefore end up with any one of a number of different air start access doors on it, without knowing which. Whirl mode was new. The regulator's own file on those 2 wings has a section for precursors, and the entry in it reads none. Lockheed found it, paid for it, and rebuilt every airplane in service. No Electra ever lost a wing to it again. Everything after that was something somebody already knew. American had been told that the triangle on its altimeter could be taken for the pointer and had agreed to take it off. One of its 6 Electras had it removed before the East River. In 1961, a set of cable connectors sat loose and unwired at O'Hare for 2 months while the airplane went on flying. Braniff's flight manual said to stay 5 miles clear of a thunderstorm, and its own meteorologists had warned about that afternoon in Texas. The defect at Cusco was written up on the flight in that same morning. By 1985, pilots up and down the fleet knew what an open access door felt like, and several carriers had already modified theirs. None of it saved anybody. In 1957, the United States Navy asked for a new patrol aircraft, and Lockheed offered it a military Electra. The prototype they flew was the 3rd Electra airframe ever built, converted. That aircraft first left the ground on the 25th of November 1959, 8 weeks after Buffalo, and 4 months before Cannelton. Nobody at that point knew what had taken the Braniff wing off. They built 757 of them, more than 4 times as many as the 170 airliners they came from, and they went to over 20 countries. The type entered service in 1962, and it is still on patrol today, more than 60 years on. The Airliner is still working too.